is calling for the country to hold fresh elections while the U.S. has already recognized Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido as the country's interim president. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro gives a press conference at Miraflores Presidential Palace in Caracas, Venezuela, on Friday, January 25, 2019. AP, Sunday, February 10. Military official drops allegiance to Maduro. An active-duty Venezuelan army colonel who is a military doctor has dropped his allegiance to President Nicolas Maduro, backing opposition leader Juan Guaido instead. Colonel Ruben Paz Jimenez urged his fellow soldiers to help allow humanitarian aid into Venezuela. The shipment of U.S. aid is currently in Cúcuta, Colombia, on the border. Maduro has vowed to prevent the aid from entering, labeling it a precursor of a U.S. invasion. A week ago, Air Force General Francisco Yanez also dropped his allegiance to Maduro. Saturday, February 9, U.S. seeks UN draft resolution calling for Venezuela elections. The United States has shared with its UN Security Council allies a draft resolution calling for international aid to be delivered in Venezuela and for a presidential vote to take place. While no date has yet been set for a vote on the American draft, and negotiations are ongoing, Russia is likely to use its veto power to block it as part of its support of Nicolas Maduro's regime, diplomats said. The text, a copy of which was obtained by AFP on Saturday, expresses full support for the National Assembly as the only democratically elected institution in Venezuela. Friday, February 8, Maduro vows to block fake aid spectacle. Maduro vowed not to let in fake humanitarian aid from the United States requested by opposition leader Juan Guaido, which is being stockpiled at the border with Colombia. Venezuela won't allow the spectacle of fake humanitarian aid because we're no one's beggars, Maduro said at a press conference. Maduro also rejected what he called the partisan and ideological nature of the statement of the EU-backed International Contact Group on Venezuela, although he said he remained open to dialogue. Thursday, February 7, U.S. aid for Venezuela arrives at Colombian border. Trucks carrying U.S. aid for Venezuela arrived at its border with Colombia. Several vehicles loaded with food and medicines rumbled into a collection center on the Colombian side of the Tienditas border bridge, which remains blocked by Venezuelan troops. Calling the aid delivery a cheap and bad show, Maduro continues to refuse all humanitarian aid shipments. The 56-year-old has repeatedly accused the United States of fomenting a coup, and says the aid would open the way to allow a U.S. military invasion. U.S. criticizes dialogue attempts, revokes Venezuela visas. The United States said it was revoking visas of Venezuelan lawmakers seated by Maduro as it criticized European and Latin American countries for seeking dialogue with the embattled leader. Elliot Adams, the U.S. envoy to Venezuela, criticized the contact group and urged all countries to shut out Maduro and deal solely with Guaido. Countries call on Maduro to hold free elections in the Uruguay capital. At the first international forum to deal with the crisis, ministers from more than a dozen European and Latin American countries called on Maduro to hold free presidential elections. The International Contact Group meeting in Montevideo said it was committed to finding a peaceful, democratic way out of the power struggle between Maduro and Guaido, without the use of force. Following 5 hours of talks, the group announced it would send a technical mission to Venezuela to establish the necessary guarantees for a credible electoral process as soon as possible, and to allow in humanitarian aid. Dozens of pro-Maduro supporters protested outside the meeting against U.S. intervention in the country. Russia says blocked from Venezuela talks in Uruguay. Russia said it had counted on being invited to an international dialogue in Montevideo on Venezuela's political crisis, but was told it could not participate. European and Latin American envoys were set to gather in the Uruguayan capital on Thursday for the first meeting of a contact group with the goal of creating conditions for a peaceful political process. We were counting on Russia having possibility to get involved in the work that will take place in Montevideo today, at least as an observer, state Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov told the RIA Novosti news agency. Wednesday, February 6, UN warns against politicizing aid. The United Nations warned against using aid as a Pun in Venezuela after the United States sent food and medicine to the country's border and accused President Nicolas Maduro of blocking its delivery with trucks and shipping containers. Humanitarian action needs to be independent of political, military or other objectives, UN spokesman Stéphane Dujarric told reporters in New York. When we see the present standoff, it becomes even more clear that serious political negotiations between the parties are necessary to find a solution leading to lasting peace for the people of Venezuela, he said. Pompeo says Maduro must let in U.S. side as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo demanded that Venezuela's military let in U.S.-backed humanitarian aid, which President Nicolas Maduro has alleged as a pretext to invasion. The Venezuelan people desperately need humanitarian aid. The U.S. and other countries are trying to help, but Venezuela's military under Maduro's orders is blocking aid with trucks and shipping tankers. Pompeo tweeted, "The Maduro regime must let the aid reach the starving people." Pompeo tweeted, using capital letters for emphasis. Guaido wants to send delegation to Italy. Opposition leader Juan Guaido wants to send a delegation to Italy, where the government is one of few European Union countries not to have backed the self-proclaimed interim president. Guaido sent a letter requesting to send a delegation to Rome, as soon as possible, to present the action plan to relaunch democracy in Venezuela through free and fair elections, Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini said. Britain, France, Germany and Spain are among 20 EU nations to side with Guaido this week after Maduro ignored their demands that he announce new presidential elections by February 3, but an attempt to muscle up the bloc's common position was vetoed by Italy, with the coalition government in Rome divided over how to handle the Venezuela crisis. Cache of U.S. weapons and ammunition recovered. A large number of weapons and ammunition sent from Miami, USA, were seized at a warehouse in Arturo Michelena International Airport in Valencia, according to a statement issued by Venezuelan Public Security Ministries on Twitter. Ammunition on his Twitter account and announced that 19 U.S.-made rifles, 118 magazines, scopes and high-caliber ammunition were recovered in the warehouse on February 3. He added that 90 communication devices and 6 mobile phones were also recovered. Heavy checkmark 19 Fusils Heavy checkmark 118 Cargadores de Fusil Heavy checkmark 4 Portafusil Heavy checkmark 3 Miras para Fusil Heavy checkmark 90 Antenas de Radio Heavy checkmark 6 Teléfonos for Inhalados en el Patio de Almacenamiento del Aeropuerto de Valencia los cuales ingresaron en el país el EUU. The opposition-dominated National Assembly had earlier warned the armed forces, which make up much of the Maduro's power base, not to cross a red line by blocking aid. Maduro says the humanitarian aid would be the forerunner of a U.S.-led invasion, insisting that nothing will enter, not one invading soldier. Venezuelan military officers used a tanker truck and huge shipping container to block access to the Tienditas Bridge, which links Cúcuta, Colombia to Arania, Venezuela. Franklin Duarte, an opposition lawmaker from the border state of Táchira, told AFP that troops from the armed forces were blocking the crossing. Argentinians protest U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Hundreds of Argentinians held a demonstration in the capital Buenos Aires against U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Non-governmental organizations, trade unions and student clubs gathered at the University of Buenos Aires and marched to the U.S. Embassy. The crowd chanted slogans such as "End U.S. pressure on Latin America" and "Establish dialogue and peace in Venezuela." The demonstrators said peace will only be achieved through dialogue, not by a military coup. Vatican open to mediating if both sides ask. Pope Francis said that the Vatican would be willing to mediate in Venezuela if both sides ask, but preliminary steps to try to bring them closer together should be taken first. Francis, speaking to reporters aboard his plane returning from a trip to Abu Dhabi, also confirmed that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro had written a letter to him, but that he had not yet read it. Maduro told Italian broadcaster Sky TG24 on Monday that he had sent the letter to the Pope for help in the process of facilitating and reinforcing dialogue. Asked about a possible direct mediation effort by the Vatican, the Pope said, "I will read the letter and see what can be done, but the initial condition is that both sides ask for it." "We are willing." Erdogan accuses EU of seeking Maduro's ouster in defiance of democracy. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Tuesday accused the European Union of seeking to overthrow embattled Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro in defiance of democracy. "On one side you will say, democracy, 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 and ballot box, ballot box, ballot box, and later you will dare to topple the government by violence and ruse," Erdogan told his ruling party lawmakers in parliament. Referring to the European Union, "We don't accept a world where the powerful is right, we only accept a world order when the right is powerful." Monday, February 4, Lima Group urges Venezuela troops to let aid in. A coalition of Western Hemisphere nations is urging Venezuela's military to allow badly needed food and medicine to enter the country as the bloc pushes for a peaceful transition of power in the South American nation. The call came Monday from the Lima Group, which is made up of nearly a dozen conservative Latin American nations and Canada. It has led the push to recognize opposition lawmaker Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's rightful leader and seeks ways to remove President Nicolas Maduro. Maduro earlier warned of civil war amid the political crisis in the country, a claim that Guaidó later dismissed. Maduro vows to defend Venezuela with his life. Maduro announced a national petition drive for peace, saying, "I will defend this threatened country with my life." Maduro made the remarks to mark National Dignity Day, the anniversary of a failed 1992 coup against late President Hugo Chavez, his predecessor. "The signatures will be taken to the White House, in rejection of intervention," said the president. Commenting on his Spanish counterpart's decision to recognize opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president, Maduro said if a coup were to happen, Pedro Sanchez's hands will be covered with blood. Guaidó to host international conference. In the meantime, the interim government challenging Maduro says it will hold an international conference to seek emergency humanitarian assistance at the headquarters of the Organization of American States in Washington. Carlos Vecchio was recently designated as ambassador to Washington by the Guaidó's self-proclaimed interim government, and he says that governments, private sector and civil society representatives will attend the Feb. 14 conference. Maduro trying to move public funds. Guaidó said the government of Maduro was trying to move up to $1.2 billion from State Development Bank Bandas to a financial entity in Uruguay, though he did not present evidence. Venezuela's information ministry did not immediately respond to a request to comment. Guaidó, in a televised speech, called on the Uruguayan government to not allow the operation, which he denounced as the theft of public funds. "We are not beggars." Maduro on aid. Maduro accused the U.S. of preparing a coup in the South American country and rejected a U.S.-backed effort to send emergency food and medicine into his country. "We are not beggars," Maduro said on Venezuelan state TV on Monday. Critics of Maduro blame the Venezuelan government's mismanagement for the lack of food and medical supplies in the country. UN will not join any group on talks. Guterres, the United Nations will not join any group of nations seeking to resolve the crisis in Venezuela, the UN chief Antonio Guterres said, rejecting an invitation to attend a meeting in Uruguay this week of neutral countries. The UN Secretariat has decided not to be part of any of these groups in order to give credibility to our continued offer of good offices to the parties to be able at their request to help find a political solution, Guterres told reporters. Maduro government rejects EU's pro-Guaidó move. Venezuela government expressed its energetic rejection to some EU states' decision to recognize Guaidó as interim president, a statement said. It said Caracas will revise bilateral relations with these governments. Meanwhile, Canada's PM Justin Trudeau announced $53 million in aid to Venezuelans. Italy blocks EU statement on Guaidó. Italy blocked the European Union statement saying that the bloc's member states would recognize Venezuela's National Assembly head Juan Guaidó as interim president. Italy's opposition has prevented a unified EU stance. Maduro writes Pope Francis for support. Maduro said in an Italian TV interview that he has written to Pope Francis asking for help in fostering dialogue. Maduro said in the interview with Sky TG24 that he hopes the letter is en route or has reached the Vatican. In the interview conducted at a military base, Maduro describes himself as being in the service of Christ's cause, and in this spirit, he has asked Francis to facilitate and reinforce dialogue with his best effort, his willingness. Maduro added he was hoping for a positive response. Moscow accuses EU of meddling. Kremlin slammed the European interference in Venezuela. It said recognizing Guaido as interim president amounted to foreign meddling, and that Venezuelans, not foreign countries, should resolve their own domestic political issues. EU countries acknowledge Guaido's interim presidency. The Netherlands and the United Kingdom are among 16 EU nations to recognize opposition leader Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela on Monday. Nicolas Maduro has not called presidential elections with an 8-day limit we have set, British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said in a tweet. France Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian had earlier said that Guaido has the capacity and the legitimacy to organize an election. The EU stated it will acknowledge Venezuela's National Assembly head Juan Guaido as interim president, a draft statement said on Monday. EU states have been sparring for days on how to address the situation of Venezuela, TRT World's Philip Ower reports. Sunday, February 3, Maduro rejects European ultimatum. Maduro rejected an ultimatum by European countries to call snap elections. 7 EU states had given Maduro a Sunday deadline to call presidential elections, or they would recognize the 35-year-old National Assembly head Juan Guaido as the interim president. Why does the European Union have to tell a country in the world that has already had elections that it has to repeat its presidential elections, because they were not won by their right-wing allies? Maduro said in an interview with a Spanish television in Caracas. Civil war a possibility. Maduro in another interview cited by the BBC, Maduro said he cannot rule out the possibility of civil war as pressure mounts on him to stand down. Everything depends on the level of madness and aggressiveness of the Northern Empire, the US, and its Western allies, he said. Stop. Donald Trump, you are making mistakes that are going to stain your hands with blood, and you are going to leave the presidency stained with blood, Maduro said. Let's respect each other. Or is it that you are going to repeat a Vietnam in Latin America, sending troops to Venezuela an option? As President Donald Trump said that sending the military to Venezuela was an option, and that he had turned down President Nicolas Maduro's request for a meeting. Certainly, it's something that's on this. It's an option, Trump said in an interview with CBS. Trump said Maduro requested a meeting months ago and he turned down the Venezuela leader. I've turned it down because we're very far along in the process, he said in excerpts from a CBS Face the Nation interview. So, I think the process is playing out. Very, very big, tremendous protests. Help Venezuela, but don't meddle. Russia's foreign ministry said that the international community should focus on helping to solve Venezuela's economic and social problems and refrain from any destructive interference. Interfax news agency reported, the international community's goal should be to help Venezuela solve socio-economic problems, without destructive meddling from beyond its borders. Alexander Shedinin, head of the ministry's Latin American department, was cited by Interfax as saying, countries supporting Guaido fueling crisis. Turkey's foreign minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said the countries which were supporting Guaido should instead have worked for negotiations to resolve Venezuela's crisis. There is a problem in a country. There is a spark that can turn into a fire at any moment. In this case, they should have contributed to the solution of the problem through dialogue, Cavusoglu told reporters in Istanbul. Cavusoglu said Turkey had tried to initiate talks on Venezuela last year between Washington and Latin American countries. But today, none of the countries that have taken these steps against Venezuela has sought dialogue. Saturday, February 2, Maduro proposes earlier elections for National Assembly. Maduro proposed on Saturday bringing forward parliamentary elections to this year. Maduro, in a speech to supporters, said the all-powerful government-controlled Constituent Assembly would debate calling earlier elections for the National Assembly, which he denounced as bourgeois. The parliamentary elections had been scheduled for 2020. TRT World's Eddie's Tionson reports from Caracas. General declares allegiance to Guaido in Twitter video. A high-ranking Venezuelan Air Force general said he had defected to Maduro and now recognized self-declared leader Juan Guaido as interim head of state, according to a video circulating on Twitter on Saturday. In the video, General Francisco Yanez, a member of the Air Force's High Command, called on other members of the military to defect. The High Command's webpage lists him, along with a photo, as the Air Force's head of strategic planning. On its Twitter account, the High Command accused the general of treason, indigno el hombre de armas que traiciona el juramento de fidelidad y lealtad a la patria de Bolívar y al legado del CMDT. Hugo Chavez, y se heredia anti pretensiones imperialistas. G. D. Francisco Yanez Traidor Pic. Twitter.com/101KNH63T. Aviation Militar, that Aviation Fan B. February 2, 2019. Yanez is the first active Venezuelan general to recognize Guaido since he proclaimed himself president on January 23. TRT World's Eddie's Tianson brings more from the capital, Caracas. Friday, February 1. Military intervention in Venezuela by the United States is not imminent, Trump's national security advisor said on Friday, but reiterated that all options remain on the table. Asked if U.S. military intervention was imminent, or by Brazil or Colombia or a combination of all three nations, Trump advisor John Bolton told the Hugh Hewitt radio show, "No, the president said all options are on the table. But our objective is a peaceful transfer of power," he said. Pence vows more pressure on Maduro in a visit to the largest community of Venezuelan exiles in the United States, and flanked by four prominent Florida Republican politicians. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence categorically rejected calls for talks with Maduro, and warned all options were on the table to force him to leave. "This is no time for dialogue. This is time for action," Pence told a few hundred people at a rally in a local church, many of whom waved Venezuelan flags and shouted, "Libertad." "The time has come to end the Maduro dictatorship once and for all," said Pence, who has emerged as one of the strongest voices against the Venezuelan leader in the administration of Trump. Steve Mort has the story. Venezuela opposition leader rejects mediation offers. Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido said on Friday he has turned down offers from the presidents of Mexico and Uruguay to negotiate with Maduro, a day before nationwide street protests called to escalate pressure on the leader to step down. In a letter to both presidents, Guaido urged them to back Venezuela's struggle, saying to remain neutral aligns them with Maduro. "At this historical moment that our country is going through, to be neutral is to be on the side of the regime that has condemned hundreds of thousands of human beings to misery, hunger and exile, including death," he said. Foreign intervention in Venezuela will deepen problem. "Any foreign intervention in Venezuela is not right, and will deepen the problem," Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said on Friday. "We are telling since the beginning. Such foreign interventions are not healthy and not right. They will not offer a solution. They will deepen the problem. God forbid, the country, Venezuela, even can be dragged into a civil war," Cavusoglu told reporters in Romania. Cavusoglu said the countries should bring dialogue into the forefront instead of taking sides. Thursday, January 31. Plot to kill Maduro busted. Venezuelan officials on Thursday said security forces took down a terrorist group backed by political opponents plotting to assassinate Maduro. Interior Minister Nestor Riveral said that retired National Guard Colonel Oswaldo Garcia Palomo was among those detained. Palomo has been an outspoken critic of Maduro and for months has declared his intention to amass a military force in exile to topple him. Riveral accuses Colombian intelligence, the CIA and exiled Venezuelan lawmaker Julio Borges of being behind the alleged mercenary group. TRT World's Eddie's Tianson reports. EU agrees to lead Venezuela crisis group. The EU announced the creation of an international contact group of European and Latin American countries to help chart a peaceful end to Venezuela's political crisis within 90 days. EU diplomatic chief Federica Mogherini said the group would aim to build trust and create conditions necessary for a credible process to emerge, enabling Venezuelans to determine their own future through the holding of new elections. Guaido says security forces threatening his family. Venezuela's self-proclaimed president Juan Guaido accused socialist leader Maduro's security forces of trying to intimidate his family. Guaido said the security service phase had gone to his house asking for his wife, Fabiana. "The dictatorship thinks it will intimidate us," Guaido said during a speech at the main university in the capital, Caracas. The 35-year-old president of the National Assembly said he had a 20-month-old daughter at home and would be holding Faez accountable for whatever they do to my baby. EU Parliament recognizes Guaido as interim president. The European Parliament recognized Venezuela's self-declared interim president Juan Guaido as the de facto head of state, a symbolic step that lawmakers said was designed to keep pressure on Maduro. EU lawmakers voted in a non-binding resolution to recognize Guaido as interim leader and called on all EU governments to follow suit. Release foreign journalists. EU's top diplomat. Venezuelan authorities must immediately release 3 detained foreign journalists and a driver, the European Union's top diplomat said on Thursday. There is a clear call from my side to release immediately your colleagues in Caracas, EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini told reporters in Bucharest after a meeting of EU defense ministers. We firmly believe that all journalists should be able to exercise their duties, responsibilities, and rights in their work, Mogherini said. Opposition meets military. Venezuela's opposition has had clandestine meetings with members of the country's military and security forces. Venezuela's self-proclaimed interim president, Juan Guaido, said in an opinion piece published on Wednesday, the transition will require support from key military contingents. We have had clandestine meetings with members of the armed forces and the security forces, Guaido said in an opinion piece published by the New York Times. The military's withdrawal of support from Mr. President Nicolas Maduro is crucial to enabling a change in government. Spain condemns media arrests in Venezuela. The Spanish government has condemned the detention of 3 reporters and a driver working for Spain's state-run FA news agency in Venezuela's capital. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's office issued a statement calling for their immediate release. FA has reported that Colombian photographer Leonardo Muñoz disappeared on Wednesday morning in Caracas and that 2 more reporters, Spaniard Gonzalo Dominguez and Colombian Morin Barriga, were later taken away from their office by members of Venezuelan intelligence service SUBIN. According to FA, Spain's government says a Venezuelan driver working for the news agency was also taken into custody. He wasn't identified. Wednesday, January 30, Mexico, Uruguay convene meeting of neutral countries. Mexico and Uruguay on Wednesday announced they would convene an international conference for countries and bodies with a neutral position to discuss the political crisis in Venezuela. The 2 countries have not yet recognized the claim by National Assembly leader Guaido to be acting president in place of leader Maduro. The conference, announced on the website of the Uruguayan presidency, is due to take place in Montevideo on February 7. Prevent Vietnam in Latin America. President Maduro pressed his case directly to the American people, asking for their help in preventing a Vietnam in Latin America. In a 45-second video released early Wednesday and shot from the presidential palace and addressed to the American people, Maduro said that the Trump administration is behind an attempt to overthrow him in a coup. He said the U.S. is looking to get its hands on Venezuela's abundant oil reserves, replicating U.S. military interventions in Iraq and Libya. Maduro ready for talk. Maduro said calls to hold early presidential elections amounted to blackmail and that the countries calling for them must wait until 2025, Russia's RIA news agency reported on Wednesday. Maduro said he was prepared to hold negotiations with the U.S.-backed opposition and added he would support early parliamentary elections. I am ready to sit at the negotiation table with the opposition for us to talk for the benefit of Venezuela. For the sake of peace in its future, Maduro said in an interview with Russia's state news agency RIA. Maduro also said Russian President Vladimir Putin had promised him more economic and military support during phone talks last week. Venezuela will meet its financial obligations to Moscow and Beijing, Maduro said. The comments came a day after Russia said Caracas could have problems servicing its debt to Moscow after Washington imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company. TRT World's Eddie's Tionson has more. Guaido calls for protests. Guaido has called for walkouts and protests to be held across the country on Wednesday. He urged Venezuelans to step outside their homes and workplaces for 2 hours beginning at noon in the first mass mobilization since he declared himself the nation's rightful leader a week ago during another round of big protests. Tuesday, January 29, court imposes travel ban on Guaido. The country's Supreme Tribunal of Justice barred self-declared President Guaido from leaving the country and froze his bank accounts. The 35-year-old head of the National Assembly legislature is prohibited from leaving the country until the end of the preliminary investigation for having caused harm to peace in the Republic, High Court President Michael Moreno said. The government-staffed High Court announced the order just hours after Chief Prosecutor Tarek William Saab announced that he was opening a criminal investigation into Guaido's anti-government activities and requested that restrictions be placed on his movements abroad. The court also approved Saab's request that all of Guaido's financial assets be frozen. The move came after the U.S. announced it was giving Guaido control of Venezuelan government's U.S. bank accounts, TRT World's Eddie's Tionson reports. White House warns against harm to Guaido. Trump's national security advisor warned of serious consequences if any harm comes to Guaido. Let me reiterate, there will be serious consequences for those who attempt to subvert democracy and harm Guaido, Trump advisor John Bolton tweeted. Pence meets Guaido. Envoy as Vice President Mike Pence met Guaido's designated envoy to the United States on Tuesday. Pence said they discussed recent sanctions actions, highlighting that these deprive Maduro and his cronies access to corrupt income and preserve the country's wealth for the people of Venezuela. The sanctions are also expected to hit daily life hard in Venezuela, where public spending is almost entirely funded by oil revenues. Attorney General seeks Guaido probe. Venezuela's Attorney General asked the Supreme Court to bar Guaido, the self-proclaimed acting president and opposition leader, from leaving the country and to freeze his assets. Tarek Saab said he had asked the court to open a preliminary investigation against Guaido, and to freeze the opposition leader's accounts. Saab didn't specify what crimes Guaido is being investigated for. Define Maduro warns U.S. Hands off Venezuela. Define Maduro warned Trump to keep his hands off Venezuela, and we should tell Donald Trump, don't mess with Venezuela. Hands off Venezuela. Donald Trump, hands off Venezuela. Immediately, Maduro said in broken English. In a defiant national broadcast, Maduro said he would take legal action to challenge the U.S. sanctions and defend Citgo Petroleum Corp., PDVSA's U.S. refining subsidiary. He also pledged to retaliate but did not announce any specific measures. U.S. Venezuela envoys trade jibes at senior U.S. and Venezuelan diplomats traded jibes at a UN-sponsored conference on disarmament, a day after the Trump administration imposed sanctions on the state-owned oil firm PDVSA in its toughest financial challenge yet to embattled Maduro. Venezuela's ambassador, Jorge Valero, said that the Trump administration was preparing a military invasion of his country and questioned whether Washington had the moral authority to impose a diktat on Caracas. Plath walked out of the conference during his comments, then returned. Guaido for amnesty to Maduro. Armigado said Maduro and the armed forces could be granted amnesty. In an interview with CNN, he said the opposition can achieve a peaceful transition away from Maduro and eventually free elections, Guaido said. He also said he had spoken to Trump a number of times and, when asked about possible military options in Venezuela, said all options were on the table. Kremlin calls U.S. sanctions illegal interference. The Kremlin said that U.S. sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company amounted to illegal and open interference in the Latin American country's domestic affairs. Moscow is assessing the impact on Russia of the sanctions and intends to use all legal mechanisms at its disposal to protect Russia's interests in Venezuela in light of the sanctions, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was quoted as saying that the U.S. sanctions imposed on Venezuela's state oil company are illegal and Russia will take all necessary steps to support the administration of Maduro. Lavrov said the sanctions amounted to an attempt by the United States to confiscate Venezuelan state assets. Russian news agencies quoted him as saying, deaths and arrests over the weekend. Human rights spokesman says at least 40 people were killed in Venezuela during the past week. The UN added that more than 850 people were detained in the country, including 696 on January 23, which is the highest number recorded for a single day in 20 years. Monday, January 28, U.S. sanctions Venezuelan state oil firm. U.S. government has announced sanctions on Venezuela's state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., also known as PDVSA. The United States is holding accountable those responsible for Venezuela's tragic decline, and will continue to use the full suite of its diplomatic and economic tools to support interim Guaido, the National Assembly, and the Venezuelan people's efforts to restore their democracy, said Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Today's designation of PDVSA will help prevent further diverting of Venezuela's assets by Maduro and preserve these assets for the people of Venezuela, he said. TRT World's Juan Carlos Lamas reports. Guaido calls for fresh protests. Guaido on Monday called for new street demonstrations across the country as army marched in capital Caracas to show support for Maduro. Guaido said opposition sympathizers should take to the streets of the crisis-hit OPEC nation on Wednesday to pass out copies of a pamphlet proposing amnesty that would give some legal protection to members of the military in hopes they will turn against Maduro. Protests left 35 dead, 850 arrested. NGOA week of protests against Maduro has left 35 people dead and 850 detained, a non-governmental organization said. We have the corroborated figure, with first name, surname, place and presumed guilty parties, of 35 people murdered in the context of the protests since Monday last week, said Rafael Uzcategui, director of the Venezuelan Program for Education Action and Human Rights. Pope afraid of bloodbath. Pope Francis said he feared bloodshed in Venezuela but that it was premature for him to take sides because it could cause more damage. Pope said he was terrified the political crisis enveloping Venezuela would descend into a bloodbath. What am I afraid of? A bloodbath, the first Latin American pontiff told journalists aboard a plane on his return trip from Panama, adding that, the problem of violence terrifies me. Australia recognizes Guaido as new president. Australia recognizes and supports Venezuela's National Assembly had Guaido as interim president until elections are held, Foreign Minister Maurice Payne said on Monday, following similar endorsements from the U.S. and Canada. Payne also called for a transition to democracy in Venezuela as soon as possible. In a statement, New Zealand refuses to back Guaido. New Zealand's Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters said New Zealand will not give official recognition to either side. It is not New Zealand's practice to make statements of recognition of governments, Peters was cited as saying in a statement emailed by his press office. Venezuela needs to decide its future through free and fair elections. This government expressed concerns about Venezuela's elections in 2018, and these concerns remain. Sunday, January 27, U.S. threats Maduro over diplomats. Bolton warned on Sunday of a significant response if U.S. diplomats or the opposition leader seeking the ouster of Maduro are threatened or intimidated. Any violence and intimidation against U.S. diplomatic personnel, Venezuela's democratic leader, Juan Guaido, or the National Assembly itself would represent a grave assault on the rule of law and will be met with a significant response, he posted on Twitter. The warning didn't address specific groups or individuals, but Bolton noted in a linked tweet that Cuba's support and control over Maduro's security and paramilitary forces was well known. Israel recognizes Guaido. Israel on Sunday officially recognized Venezuela's National Assembly chief Guaido as president, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, following close ally Washington in endorsing the opposition leader. Netanyahu announced in an online video that Israel was joining the United States, Canada and a host of South American countries in recognizing the new leadership in Venezuela. Maduro rejects EU ultimatum. Maduro rejected an ultimatum to call a national election within 8 days, describing European countries as insolent for making it. In an interview with Turkish broadcaster CNN Turk aired on Sunday and dubbed into Turkish from Spanish, Maduro also said opposition leader Guaido had violated the constitution by declaring himself leader. Maduro also said he was open to dialogue, and that a meeting with Trump, while improbable, was not impossible. TRT World's Shamim Chowdhury has more. Saturday, January 26, UK, France, Germany and Spain said on Saturday they would give Maduro 8 days to call elections in the South American country or they would recognize Guaido as interim leader in charge of calling an election. The government of Spain gives Nicolas Maduro 8 days to call free, transparent and democratic elections. If that doesn't happen, Spain will recognize Juan Guaidó as interim president in charge of calling these elections, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said in a statement. Similar declarations were made by UK, Germany and France. Friday, January 25. Controversial GOP veteran to restore democracy. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Friday tapped Elliott Abrams, a central figure in Ronald Reagan's controversial anti-communist campaigns in Central America, as a new envoy to restore democracy in Venezuela. Pompeo announced the appointment of Abrams 2 days after Washington declared Maduro to be illegitimate and recognized Guaidó as the interim president. Pompeo said Abrams will help the Venezuelan people fully restore democracy and prosperity to their country. Abrams under Reagan channeled generous U.S. support to anti-communist forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador. He initially dismissed the massacre of nearly 1,000 civilians by the Salvadoran army at El Mozote in 1981. He pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts during the Iran-Contra scandal. Maduro ready to meet Guaidó. Maduro said on Friday that he was ready to meet presidency rival Guaidó. But Maduro's offer for talks was promptly rejected by Guaidó. Addressing a news conference, he said that Venezuelan armed forces have promised to protect his legitimate government. Guaidó claims international support. Guaidó, who has proclaimed himself interim president with U.S. support, says there is strong international support for his interim government. Addressing a rally in Caracas, he said that Maduro has to leave, adding it would happen with international support. UN rights boss calls for independent investigation into deaths. The United Nations human rights boss Michelle Bachelet calls for an independent investigation into alleged excessive use of force by Venezuelan security forces, citing reports of 20 people killed and more than 350 detained in protests this week. I am extremely concerned that the situation in Venezuela may rapidly spiral out of control with catastrophic consequences, Bachelet, a former president of Chile, said in a statement, urging political leaders to hold talks to defuse the situation. Thursday, January 24. Military backs Maduro. Venezuela's powerful military threw its weight behind Maduro on Thursday as U.S.-backed Guaidó pressed a direct challenge to his authority, and the fate of the crisis-racked country hung in the balance, with the death toll from days of street protests jumping to 26. Washington seeks to cut Maduro's revenue. Trump's national security advisor Bolton said the White House is focused on disconnecting Maduro from his sources of revenue. We think, consistent with our recognition of Juan Guaidó as the constitutional interim president of Venezuela, that those revenues should go to the legitimate government. It's very complicated, Bolton told reporters at the White House. Maduro hails support of Turkey, Russia and China. Venezuela's president expressed his gratitude to Turkey, Russia and China on Thursday for their support after Guaidó declared himself interim president. I thank Russia, China, Turkey and other governments and people of the world for their strong support of the legitimately established government of Venezuela, Maduro said in a Twitter post. Venezuela is not alone, he added. Guaidó would consider granting Maduro amnesty. Guaidó says he would consider granting amnesty to Maduro and his allies if they helped return Venezuela to democracy. Guaidó gave his first public comments to Univision on Thursday since declaring himself interim president of Venezuela. Guaidó's comments are part of a soon-to-be-aired interview that was published on Univision's website. The National Assembly leader says that amnesty is on the table for anybody willing to help return Venezuela to constitutional order. Germany backs National Assembly. The German government called for democratic new elections in Venezuela, saying it stood with the opposition-controlled National Assembly with regard to "We support the National Assembly, which is elected by the people." Maduro has no democratic legitimacy as president. U.S. orders non-essential staff out. The U.S. ordered non-emergency embassy staff to leave Venezuela but stopped short of complying with a full expulsion ordered by Maduro, who Washington says is no longer president. The State Department in a notice said it had ordered non-emergency U.S. government employees to depart Venezuela. The U.S. government has limited ability to provide emergency services to U.S. citizens in Venezuela, it said. U.S. citizens should strongly consider leaving Venezuela, the State Department said. Venezuela to shut U.S. Embassy. Venezuela will close its embassy and all consulates in the United States, Maduro said on Thursday, one day after he broke off diplomatic relations in response to U.S. recognition of an opposition leader as interim president. In a speech, Maduro added that he agreed with a call by Mexico and Uruguay for dialogue between Venezuela's government and the opposition for a resolution to the South American country's political crisis. TRT World's John Brain reports from Washington. Putin calls Maduro. Russian President Putin on Thursday called Maduro and expressed support, the Kremlin said. The president of Russia expressed support for the legitimate authorities of Venezuela in the context of a domestic political crisis that has been provoked from the outside, it said. Pompeo warns Maduro. Pompeo on Thursday warned Maduro against use of force on mass demonstrations as he urged further international support for the self-declared acting president. The time for debate is done. The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate, Pompeo told the Organization for American States at a special meeting at its Washington headquarters. His speech was interrupted by a pro-Maduro protester. But we must learn the lessons of the past and not be in the business of regime change or supporting coups, as we have in Chile, Guatemala, Brazil. The U.S. has a long history of inappropriately intervening in Latin American nations. We must not go down that road again. 3/3, Bernie Sanders, at @Saunders, January 24, 2019. Trump comments on Venezuela are shocking. Erdogan. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on Thursday that he believed the people of Venezuela would continue to support Maduro. Speaking at a joint news conference with his Maltese counterpart in Ankara, Erdogan said he found Trump's comments on Venezuela shocking and added that democracies needed to respect election results. Maduro is legitimate president. Of Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino said on Thursday that Maduro was the country's legitimate president and that the opposition was carrying out a coup. Padrino said the United States and other governments were carrying out an economic war against Venezuela, an OPEC nation with the world's largest crude reserves. Maduro must go. Senior EU lawmaker Maduro must step down and allow the country's Congress to lead the country back to democracy, one of the European Parliament's most senior lawmakers said on Thursday, taking a tougher stance than EU foreign ministers. President Maduro has lost any legitimacy to lead his country. He needs to step aside, David McAllister, a German conservative who chairs the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, said in a statement. Iran throws its support behind Maduro. Iran opposes all foreign interference in Venezuela's domestic affairs, Bahram Qasemi, a spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry, said in a statement. Qasemi voiced hope that Venezuela's internal political disputes might be resolved by its people in government. Opposition supporters take part in a rally against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's government in Caracas, Venezuela. January 23, 2019. Reuters. Macron hails Venezuelans marching for liberty. French President Emmanuel Macron said the May 2018 election of Maduro was illegitimate and saluted the bravery of Venezuelans who are demanding freedom. In a tweet on Thursday in French and Spanish, Macron added his own voice to the European Union's declared support for the restoration of democracy. Macron said that he salutes the courage of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans marching for their liberty. Spain backs Venezuela Parliament, calls for free vote. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez told Guaido in a phone call on Thursday that he supported the legitimacy of the Venezuelan Parliament and called for free elections, in line with the European Union's position. The Spanish leader acknowledged Guaido's courage with which he has been handling the situation, a government spokesman said. China opposes outside interference. China said it opposes outside interference in Venezuela and supports its efforts to protect its independence and stability. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying called for all sides to calmly and reasonably find a peaceful solution. China supports efforts made by the Venezuelan government to protect the country's sovereignty, independence and stability, Hua told a regular briefing in Beijing. I want to emphasize that outside sanctions or interference usually make the situation more complicated and are not helpful to resolving the actual problems. EU says protests cannot be ignored. The European Union called for Venezuela authorities to respect the civil rights, freedom and safety of Guaido, but stopped short of following Washington and recognizing him as interim president. On the 23rd of January, the people of Venezuela have massively called for democracy and the possibility to freely determine their own destiny. These voices cannot be ignored. The 28 countries of the bloc said in a joint statement, the Venezuelan people have the right to peacefully demonstrate, to freely choose its leaders and decide its future. Russia warns U.S. against military intervention. Russia warned the United States not to intervene militarily in Venezuela, saying such a move would trigger a catastrophic scenario. The Interfax news agency cited the deputy foreign minister as saying. Interfax cited Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, as saying Moscow would stand with Venezuela to protect its sovereignty and the principle of non-interference in its domestic affairs. Avert disaster. UN head appeals-in-chief Antonio Guterres appealed for dialogue in Venezuela to avoid the political crisis spiraling out of control, after Guaido declared himself interim president. What we hope is that dialogue can be possible, and that we avoid an escalation that would lead to the kind of conflict that would be a disaster for the people of Venezuela and for the region, he said at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Sovereign governments have the possibility to decide whatever they want, the UN Secretary-General said on a Facebook Live broadcast from Davos. What we are worried about with the situation in Venezuela is the suffering of the people of Venezuela, he said. Wednesday, January 23, U.S. calls for army intervention. A U.S. State Department statement called on Venezuela's army to act against Maduro's government. Venezuela's defense minister Pedrino hit back, saying the armed forces did not recognize Guaido's authority. The nation's soldiers don't accept the president imposed by obscure interests, nor one self-proclaimed outside of law, said Pedrino on Twitter. Maduro lacks authority to sever ties with the U.S. United States rejected a move by Maduro to break diplomatic ties, saying it did not think he had the authority to cut ties and it would conduct relations with a government led by Guaido. Get out. Leave Venezuela. Maduro announced he was breaking off diplomatic ties with the U.S. after Trump recognized Guaido as the interim president. I've decided to break diplomatic and political relations with the imperialist government of the U.S., Maduro told thousands of supporters in the capital Caracas. Get out. Leave Venezuela. Here there's dignity, damn it, he said, giving the U.S. delegation 72 hours to quit the country. Pro and anti-Maduro recognitions. Most Latin American nations on Wednesday recognized the 35-year-old leader of Venezuela's opposition-dominated National Assembly as interim president, as did the U.S. and Canada. Long-standing leftist allies Bolivia and Cuba were the only countries in the region to explicitly voice support for Maduro, as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Paraguay and Peru backed Guaido. Mexico also said it backs Maduro's rule and it would not take sides, branding support for Guaido a violation of sovereignty. Turkey also offered support in a phone call to Maduro. Juan Guaido declares himself President. Guaido, during a rally against President Maduro's government in Caracas, declared himself interim president, calling for free elections to end Maduro's presidency. Massive rallies. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans gathered in Caracas to hold rival protests. Tuesday, January 22, U.S. trying to force a coup. Maduro accused Pence of forcing a coup in his country. Never before has a high-level official said that the opposition should overthrow the government, Maduro said. Hola, I'm Mike Pence. Pence issued a video message of support to Venezuelans opposing Maduro's rule. On behalf of President Donald Trump and all the American people, let me express the unwavering support of the United States as you, the people of Venezuela, raise your voices in a call for freedom, Pence said after offering a greeting of hola, which means hello, in Spanish. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He has never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and has maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him. Source: TR World and Agencies.